Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Sorry, new kid. But you're last in today, so you're our candidate this year. The kid in front of our classroom door relaying this to me looked a mixture of pity and relief. His nose taped over and a black eye, an immediate standout feature. I was later told his name was Frank, and the damage was a result of a fight with the kid in the grade above us for calling his mom a slut. He didn't make eye contact with me directly, instead drawing his attention to my shirt, a Legend of Zelda fan art piece adorning the center. Man, this sucks. We could have been friends. The slight hurt in his voice was not even remotely close to how shut out I was already feeling. First day in a new school, desperate for a fresh start, and doing my best to make a good impression. Totally out the window. This doesn't seem fair, I protested, knowing this may just be an elaborate prank on the new girl. I wasn't about to deal with being a joke on day one. Look, let me introduce myself. My name is Zoe Hart. He shook his head, some of his friends seated in the class behind him leaning forward, genuine shock rippling across their faces, as if I'd bitten the head off a small animal. No, this isn't how it works, new kid. This isn't just a class thing. It's a community thing. He looked back hesitantly, and the class nodded, no semblance of glee or cruelty on their face. I dare say for a bunch of 12-year-olds, they were downright forlorn at the prospect. He sighed and continued. Our town has this every November, and the rules are simple. The last one into a community function is no name for the month. He leans in and speaks quietly. Just bear with it, and we'll be friends afterwards, okay? I'm sorry. I really am. With that, he takes his seat and I shuffled into the room, a sea of completely apathetic faces staring straight ahead. I'd made an effort to look my best self in spite of a new environment, hoping it would make a good impression. But instead of being invited to speak by the teacher, the room fell silent until I sat down at the back, next to a fogged-over window and a small supply cupboard. I was in disbelief that the teacher joined in on it, not glancing in my direction or checking her register to see if I was present. Even after the bell rang and we went to recess or lunch, I was a non-entity. People didn't walk through me or shove me out of the way, but they didn't go out of their way to assist me if I fell over or give me alternative food when I brought up that my file says I have a deathly allergy to peanuts. Every fiber of me wanted to cry, to scream that I was desperate to be acknowledged and that I wouldn't hurt anyone. But I choked back the emotions piling up in my throat, slung my bag over my shoulder, and resolved to just read or play some video games on my recess, if this is how it was going to be. Different schools, different traditions, same bullshit. My parents had jobs in the journalism industry, and moving around for promotions or alternative contracts was their forte. By the time I was nearly 13, I had moved to 5 different schools, and I'd become accustomed to the changes. Most kids become jaded and try not to make connections with others, knowing they'll just be gone in a year or less anyway. But I had this innate desire to connect with people and make the most of my situation. I couldn't help myself. That's what made this so much harder. I probably would have caved in after day 2 if Phil hadn't shown up. It was the beginning of what already felt like a lifelong routine. I sat down at my desk and began to let my mind wander, focusing on what I'd enjoy playing when I got home. making some comfort food and joining my mom at the gym after, so I didn't feel gross. I idly doodled a sketch of me holding the master's sword high, a bolt of lightning striking at the hilt and electrifying me in a comical fashion.
That's awesome, dude. What's your favorite game in the series? I'd say mine is the newest one. My mom got it for me last Christmas, but I haven't had a chance to play in a while.
The jubilant voice cut through the air, as if a firecracker had been let off by my ear, his positivity irradiating through me and borderline making me jump out of my seat with excitement and confusion. Startled at the notion of someone talking to me, I snap my pencil and the entire room freezes. The boys at the front next to Frankie turn to him and whisper, the slightest of side glances in my direction, and they shake their heads at the both of us before turning back. I turn to look at him and I see a mess of spiky black hair, a dusty red flannel shirt with sleeves underneath, the sweatshirt logo of a Dark Souls reference. He looks like a kid completely out of time, but very comfortable in himself. He smiles at me and seems to be waiting for my reply. But for that brief moment, words had failed me. Twilight Princess, I stammer, my hands fumbling over one another. I really like the dark plot, and Midna is so cool. I'm confused, but the joy of conversation overtakes me, and I decide that if I'm going to be ignored for tradition's sake, I may as well get it over with now. I'm Zoe, by the way, Zoe Hartwell. But instead of being repulsed, his eyes light up. He beams at me, offering a hand adorned with various faded concert tags and festival markers.
I'm Phil Faulty. Good to meet you, man.
He gives me a fist bump before leaning back on his chair. The hinges squeak as he puts the rubber of his pencil to his lips, tapping it contemplatively as he studies me. The lesson around us seems to continue without any notice of our discussion.
You're the new no-name, aren't you?
He says after a few moments. My face sags and I feel the inevitable rejection imminently approaching. Yeah? I guess you don't want to be friends now, huh? I say, my body language matching my face as I hunch over my work, preparing to just draw silently for the rest of the day. A friendship, dead on arrival. To my surprise, he leans forward with a satisfying thump and turns toward me, still smiling.
Nah, I was the no-name last year. I know how it goes,
he declares, almost matter-of-factly, the positivity refusing to leave his voice. But Frank and his friends said that this is tradition, I replied, nudging my head towards him as he took notes from the class. He didn't seem like a nasty kid, so much as one caught up doing what was asked of him. Phil made an audible acknowledgement before turning back to me.
Well, he's not wrong. This is tradition, but, well, I always wished I had a friend throughout that shit, and I guess I just want to do it for you, you know?
I immediately felt more comfortable around him, and the more he spoke, the bolder I felt. Won't they, cast you out again permanently, or beat you up? He laughed, shaking his head.
Nah, nothing like that. But even if there were punishments, it wouldn't matter. I'm not really all that acknowledged around here lately anyway, so no harm done.
He patted my shoulder before the bell rang, and the class shuffled out for lunch. I saw a chance to bond and decided I had nothing to lose. Phil, I brought lunch from home since the stuff here I'm allergic to. Want to split it and play some Animal Crossing? He smiled so sincerely, nodding silently as I grabbed my stuff before heading for the door.
What happens if you eat the food here? Does your head swell up and burst?
He asked, imitating the sound of a popping balloon with blood chunks spraying everywhere. I laughed for the first time since I got to this town. No, nothing like that. I'd just choke and die without an EpiPen. Come on, let's go. I'll even let you visit my town. If you promise not to dig holes in the garden, I say, teasing him with a jovial grin.
I wouldn't dream of it. There's never anything good to find in secret holes anyway.
He dryly replies before shoving me and laughing at his own terrible joke. The next 2 weeks were comparable bliss to those first few days, while the rest of the class refused to acknowledge me, and even some store attendants around town would only take my money and nothing more. I felt it to be tolerable with Phil by my side. He'd show me around the school and tell me all the best hiding spots, sharing legends I was 99% certain he made up to impress me, but I didn't care. He made me feel like I mattered, and it was something I steadily realized very few people had done in my life to that point. I took it to heart and made a point to ask my parents and my older brother in college about their days, spend more time with them, and learn things I'd never thought to ask about before. As we reached the end of the month, I'd decided to make him a drawing of the two of us hanging out in a treehouse filled with treasures and weapons. Some days before, he'd confessed Adventure Time was one of his favorite shows to me, and how much he missed it since he didn't get cable anymore. As the final days of No Name November were in sight, I was determined to show my gratitude to him, and remind him we were best friends after this was over too, even if that meant he was stuck with me. I made my way down the hall. I was running late thanks to a doctor's appointment, and the silence was as unsettling as the details you often ignore when your mind is occupied by conversations, drama, and the walk to your next lesson. Now, I was conscious of the echo my footsteps made, the tributes to someone on the walls across the lockers, flowers and spikes covering one person's locker further down the hall from my room. I decided I'd take a look later on, and maybe Phil could shed some light on what had happened. I came into the sound of utter silence, the entire group already deep in reading time, and the teacher herself perusing what looked like an Edgar Allan Poe novel. I sheepishly made my way back to where Phil sat, his back against the supply closet, and anxiety painted across his face. "Dude, what's wrong? Did the girl you like look in your direction?" "Dork," I said, playfully punching him and smiling, something he did not reciprocate. In the years following this, I have never seen such a paradoxical expression. He was anxious, miserable, and accepting all at once, as if each face was jostling for the spotlight on his face, and he was powerless to control which one came out. He flashed me a smile before a grimace replaced it, his knee twitching incessantly.
"Zoe, I'm leaving today. I'm being transferred."
He looked so ashamed of himself, but didn't break his eye contact with me.
"I knew from the moment we spoke that I'd be leaving at the end of this month, but I wanted so badly to stay with you and be friends that I just..."
His eyes welled up and he sniffed, wiping them with his sleeve.
"I'm sorry. I was being selfish. I just didn't want you to think that I'd abandoned you when everyone else was still ignoring you."
I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to yell at him for keeping it from me, to slap him even. But I knew how important this last day was, and I took a deep breath before flexing my fingers on the table in front of me, grabbing my textbook and putting the drawing I made on his desk. The tension in his body ceased as he held it up and stared at it. For a moment, I couldn't see his face, but I could hear him whimpering. He held it to his chest and with his eyes closed simply said,
"Thank you, Zoe."
We spent that final day making terrible jokes at each other's expense, making plans to stay in touch that we knew we could never truly keep, and sharing a hug that lasted a little bit too long. His arm draped over my shoulders as we sat in the hall and waited out the last few minutes before the final period. I meant to ask, I saw something in the halls, and it looked like there was a kind of tribute on one of the lockers. What's that all about? I asked, knowing I'd probably forget if the school really did start talking to me soon after.
Oh, that's my locker.
He said, matter-of-factly, twirling his spikes with his free hand.
They heard I was leaving, and I guess they wanted to give me a good send-off. Pretty sweet, right? I've come a long way from just the kid in the crawl space.
He laughed heartily, and I chuckled, not sure what he meant, and assuming it was an embarrassing time in his life, not wishing to pry. The bell rang and we made our way to the door. Everyone else had already shuffled in, as we lingered outside, preferring to go in once the class had settled.
If you don't mind, Zoe, I'm gonna dip here,
he said, the positivity now with an air of reluctance. I felt my heart sink, but I nodded and wrapped my arms around him. You'll always be my best friend, Phil. No matter what else happens, okay? I said through muffled sobs as he chuckled.
I know. You too. And hey, if you ever need to be reminded of me, you can just go to my hiding spot. You'll always be able to think of me that way.
He took me by the shoulders and wiped the tears away, kissing my forehead. I felt a surge of butterflies as he smiled at me.
Check the crawl space. You'll know what you're looking for. You've got a bright future ahead of you, Zoe. Just make sure you're never studying alone, okay? You never know what kind of weirdos will try their luck, and you're too cool to end up with one of them.
He flashed me a grin before backing off and running down the hallway, turning the corner and disappearing from my life once and for all. I took a few moments to recompose myself before going back into the class, to the sound of thunderous applause and smiles. Every student that I would have once described as a gray shell of apathy, now all full of their own vibrant colors. Freckles and curly hair jutting out at me, accents and body types I was oblivious to before now, suddenly became immediately obvious. At the front, the teacher and Frank stood with smiles on their faces, Frank outstretching a hand that I took on autopilot. Congrats, Zoe. You made it to the end of No Name November, and you didn't crack once. You're officially a member of the community now. He leaned in closer. And I'm honestly so sorry about this. I really do want to be your friend, you know? I hope I can make it up to you. I looked at them with such confusion. Happy but utterly bewildered by the display they'd put on. This is great, and I'm glad we can all talk now, but isn't this for Phil? The room's atmosphere changed in an instant. Some students looked at me with terror, while others looked away. One girl began to tremble as her friend held her. Frank went pale and looked at me with a look I couldn't immediately place. Zoe, where did you hear that name? I half laughed, the prank obviously still not over. Dude, his locker is adorned outside, and he told me himself he was leaving. I assumed that's what all this was for. I waved my arms around the room, laughing. The room felt so cold as the teacher stood up, shaking as she approached me, kneeling down to my level, and speaking in a low voice, with an ungodly amount of severity. Zoe, this is really important. Where did you hear all this? I felt immediately on edge. I was obviously old enough to know something was wrong, and I wasn't the type to lie. If Phil is in trouble for skipping, I don't want to be the one to get him into crap before he starts his new school. I began, her eyes widening as she motioned to me to go outside with Frank, instructing the rest of the class to stay in there as we spoke outside. I could see Frank was shaking, holding back tears as the teacher tried to calm him. "Zoe, that locker isn't for Phil leaving. He went missing a year ago." Frank's voice was trembling, and his composure was rapidly failing him. He's my brother. I don't know what happened to him. But if you know anything at all, Zoe, please." I never heard the register being called out in class, so I never noticed the last name. My knees felt weak. I never looked at the posters adorning the locker rooms that said, "Missing since 2010. My stomach turned over and every emotion was turning into bile. I never inspected the locker that was covered in tributes from classmates and teachers. My vision began to blur as I leaned against the locker and began breathing heavily, the teacher trying to keep me calm as Frank looked on, confused but distraught. "Supply closet. Crawl space." I breathed over and over as I felt my body give out, and the sounds of rushing filled my ears before a series of frantic bangs, screaming, and alarms rang out to black. Phil had gone missing during his own nomination of No Name November. He'd been silently working away for the first couple weeks, walking home with his little brother Frank every day while their mom was working a double shift to pay the bills. One day, he simply didn't meet Frank to walk home, and it took Frank nearly 12 hours to report his brother missing due to his mother's second job working nights at the bar. I was cleared very quickly of any suspicion since I had only come into the state a month prior, and I wasn't mentally able to deal with the conversation of Phil not being real. They chalked it up to hearing from someone else at school and launched an investigation. This, of course, yielded nothing. Phil had been stuffed into a crawl space behind the supply closet in the class. They still don't know how he got there, or if someone put him there. Rumors spread that he'd simply fallen asleep and gotten stuck. I wanted so badly to believe them, and so did everyone else. But the look of abject horror in his mummified face, half caved-in skull, and tear marks on his trademark flannel betrayed that theory entirely. I moved schools again soon after and went a few miles south to an all-girls school. Socializing became something I struggled massively at, but Frankie helped with that. Understanding one another's grief brought us close, and inevitably we ended up together, now looking at starting a family of our own in this town. That still carries on the tradition of No Name November. I think about Phil's fate a lot. How someone who was forgotten by the town at the age of 13 was able to successfully vanish overnight. I think about how powerful a name and an identity can be to someone in a world where it's so easy to slip under the cracks through your own volition or someone else's. And as I look over a sea of unmarked graves in my town, I think of how lucky I am to have had someone like Phil guiding me, to ensure I survived my own No Name November, to ensure I wasn't forgotten, too.
Andrew Rivers traveled for business. Sometimes he took his own car, other times a rental. Rentals were a mixed bag for him, because he never knew ahead of time if he would get a decent car. This meant one he could sleep in. His SUV had enough room in the back to lay down comfortably when the seats were folded. It wasn't a bed and mattress, but it was surely cheaper than a room for the night, and he was anything if not frugal. With his business growing, Andrew was beginning to drive farther and farther to recruit more clients. Soon, he might have to start outsourcing, but he was a hands-on kind of guy and didn't know if he could trust anyone to do this side of the job. Plus, he liked to travel. His current venture was promising to be very lucrative, and although he was going to miss Thanksgiving, he felt it was worth it. Hours from home, he stood outside his car at a rest stop with a camera in his hands taking pictures. He'd never been this close to the Rocky Mountains before, and they were breathtaking, just like in postcards. Dusk was descending upon the world, giving the mountains a red glow. It might have been eerie, if it wasn't so beautiful. Further up the road, he pulled into his booked motel. He alternated the nights when he would slept in his car. He needed to look his best when meeting clientele and could only do so much without a shave and shower at least every other day. After getting comfy, he booted his laptop to check on the pictures he'd taken. They weren't all keepers, but most turned out okay. One puzzled him, though. He didn't remember taking it. It wasn't of the mountains at all. The photo was of the tree line below the parking lot he'd pulled into. There wasn't much light with the setting sun, and the image was fuzzy, but two clear silver dots stood out. They might have been the eyes of some animal, or just specks of dust in the air, but for some reason, he found them unsettling, like they were something he was never supposed to see. Unable to get the image out of his mind, Andrew had difficulty falling asleep. The silver eyes followed him into his dreams, stalking him, showing up around every corner, in everyone's face. He woke in the morning, not the least bit refreshed, to find the words, "Find You," painted on his windshield in deep red, almost brown letters. Some kids playing a prank on him, noticing the out-of-state license plate, he figured. Upon closer study, the paint smelled wretched, and brought to mind horrific images of its true origin. Worse, it refused to come off. Andrew scrubbed and scraped, but it seemed baked on, as if it had been sitting in the sun all day. He ended up buying some glue dissolvent, and even that left some behind. The letters didn't take up much space, but they would be a distraction he didn't need while driving on unfamiliar roads. Still, he'd wasted enough time on it, as it was, and couldn't afford to linger any longer. Andrew continued on his journey, continued doing his job, and stopped to take pictures of the scenery. This time he was careful of what he captured, checking each snapshot after taking it, making sure nothing was watching him. When the time came for him to hunker down for the night, it took him a while to find a decent place. Each town was different, and he wasn't always able to find an abandoned building to park behind or someplace off the beaten path where he wouldn't be disturbed. Finally, he found a quarry that didn't appear to be operational anymore. It was quiet. Perfect. Andrew had a few snacks to eat before climbing into the back to spread out some blankets. Due to the previous night's restless slumber, he fell asleep quickly. He was woken in the middle of the night by a noise he couldn't identify. It sounded like a large animal. A cow, maybe. He wasn't a livestock expert. Then he heard another sound, one he did recognize. Children's laughter. While ordinarily a joyous sound in the dead of night and the middle of nowhere, it was like something out of a horror movie. Accompanying them was the pitter-patter of feet running around his car. He wanted to get up and look outside, but truthfully, he was frightened. If it really was children, he had nothing to worry about, and he tried to convince himself such was the case. But the laughter was tainted by a wheezing sickness, a throaty rasp. It was deeply disturbing, and couldn't have belonged to a child. He didn't know how long he laid in his car listening to them, He hoped if he was quiet, they wouldn't know he was there and eventually go away. But things only got worse. The children became more brazen, knocking on his car, tapping on the glass. Occasionally the car would lurch as if someone had shoved it. Andrew eventually lifted his head to peek out the window, wanting to see what was going on, but saw only vague shadows dancing in the scattered moonlight. Suddenly the roof groaned under the weight of someone or something climbing onto it. A deep, guttural bellow rented the air before what sounded like a waterfall splashed all over the car. Horrible images of a beast vomiting on his car sprang unwanted to his mind. As the roof began to buckle, Andrew knew he could hold his tongue no longer. He shouted for them to get off his car, for them to go away and leave him alone. And it all stopped. It was now dead quiet. He risked taking another look outside and saw the silver eyes. The same eyes in the photo. The same eyes from his dreams. Then a child spoke. "Please let us in." It started as the voice of a little girl, but ended twisted and raspy. Soon more silver eyes joined the first, as did more bitter, raspy child voices. "Play with us. We won't bite. Be our friend. Come outside." Soon he was surrounded and hailed non-stop. Andrew grabbed his phone to call for help, only to find no signal. He knew it was likely to happen among the mountains, and of course, it would fail him when he needed it the most. Covering his ears and closing his eyes, he wished it would all go away. This couldn't be happening. Maybe he was just dreaming. Then he woke up. His blankets and clothing were in a knotted mess, and he was sweating profusely even though it was cold outside, but he had made it through the night. It was just a nightmare. But would a nightmare leave child-sized handprints all over the windows and a roof dented under the weight of some unknown animal, which now appeared to be sleeping on his hood, blocking his windshield? Scanning the immediate area outside the vehicle, he ensured he was alone, other than the beast on his car, before opening the rear hatch and climbing out. The sun couldn't be seen over the trees, but dawn had arrived no more than an hour ago, he was sure. How long had the ordeal gone on last night? Had he fallen asleep from exhaustion? Making his way warily to the front of the car, Andrew found not an animal like he was expecting, but more paint splashed all over the windshield. And written in the paint, in small, scraggly letters, were the words, "Find you, follow you." Andrew was beside himself, horrified. It couldn't be the same kids who were messing with him. It was impossible. That motel was at least 200 miles back. But how could the messages be the same? Were these people following him? Was it a cult of some kind? And were they children, or was it some twisted game? Was this going to continue to haunt him during his travels? Would it follow him home? He decided to find a police station and report the incident. Like the last time, the paint refused to be removed. Even the glue dissolver barely put a dent in it. With the windshield obstructed, there was no way Andrew could drive the car. So he stayed there, spending hours scrubbing it off, using up all the glue dissolvent, and eventually getting enough of it off to be able to drive into the nearest town to find a car wash. But its superior clean didn't live up to its name. Andrew had to settle with the half-finished job. He'd already spent too much time on it and was way behind on schedule. At least a room had been booked for that night. When he had time, he'd have to alter some of his plans. There was no way he was sleeping in his car again on this trip. Unfortunately, luck was not on his side. Having gotten a late start on this leg of his journey and having to drive slower and more carefully due to his partially obstructed view, Andrew showed up to his motel late, and due to the high demand of Thanksgiving weekend, his room had been given away. While furious, he understood and accepted the reasons for this and set out to find other accommodations. He found none. He tried the next town and the next. As night fell, Andrew became worried, then desperate, then scared. Whatever was stalking him would find him again, he was sure. He did not want to spend another night in his car, yet options were wearing thin. Weary from the lack of sleep from the night before, his eyes grew heavy, and after nearly driving off the road one too many times, he knew he couldn't go on. He found a brightly lit strip mall parking lot in a small town to stay in for the night. It wasn't an ideal location for a proper rest, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Surely he wouldn't be attacked in the open for all to see. Feeling safe, he settled in and began to doze off. Then there came a rapping at the window. Andrew sat up to see a police officer standing outside his car, peering inside with a flashlight. Noticing the out-of-state plates on the car, the cop had been watching him. Andrew stepped outside and was told he couldn't stay there. Reminded of his earlier promise to tell the authorities about his ordeal, Andrew explained his situation: the missed hotel, the Night Stalkers, the paint on his car, of which there was still evidence. It was quite the story, and the officer was skeptical, suspecting Andrew of being either drunk or stoned. However, he granted Andrew what he felt was a small mercy by not bringing him into custody. He told Andrew that if he felt strongly about the incident in the morning, he could come to the police station and file a report, but he had to leave until then. Unless, that is, he wanted to go to the station right now, in handcuffs. So Andrew got back into his car and drove around to find another spot to sleep. Not wanting any trouble from the police, he settled for parking outside of town, just past the reach of the streetlights, behind what appeared to be an abandoned gas station. He'd never been more scared in his life, and he knew he wasn't going to get any sleep that night. But since fear and stress can be exhausting, and since he'd slept little after his encounter the previous night, he was out quickly. He was woken quickly, as well as by another rapping on the window. Assuming it was the officer again, Andrew sat up and looked out the window, but there was no flashlight this time. No policeman. Just a dozen or so pairs of silver eyes glinting despite the darkness. As he'd expected and feared, the creatures had returned. They hailed him again, pounding on his car, demanding to be let in or for him to come out. Their creepy, lilting voices trailed off in hacking, acidic warbles that felt like daggers in his ears. They said he couldn't hide from them forever. They said they'd find a way inside. They said they would take him. "What do you want from me?" Andrew shouted at them. The voices went quiet, and just the labored breathing of what sounded like much larger beasts could be heard. Finally, they began again, only this time their voices were excruciatingly deep, thumping into his ears like too much bass. "We want to play with you. We want to be inside you. We want you inside us. We want to taste you. We want to be you." All these answers came simultaneously, booming in his head as if they were originating there. He heard them all individually, somehow, but wished he hadn't. He wished he hadn't asked the question. He wished he'd gone straight to the police station, in shackles or not. He wished he'd never gone on this damn trip. The pounding on his car began again, with more fervor than before. Violent blows assaulted the side windows, and as they began to crack, Andrew knew he had to get out of there. He crawled over the seats to get behind the wheel and started the car. When the headlights came on, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. Shapes. Silhouettes. The light from his car did not touch these creatures, but he could see them through the illumination of the spaces between them, as if he were looking at a negative. They were the same size as children, only with pointed heads and long arms that reached the ground like a gorilla. And those haunting, silver eyes, they seemed to pierce right through him, turning his blood jelly, his legs to stone, his mind to mush. Then there was the big one, the largest shape among them. It was the size of an elephant, maybe larger, 12 or 15 feet tall. Like a woolly mammoth, it appeared to be hairy too, unlike its smaller brethren. Its breath sent billows of smoke into the chill air. Somehow finding the strength, both in mind and body, to put the car in drive, Andrew floored it. Chaos erupted. Most of the little creatures dived out of the way. Some of them landed on his car and began pounding on the windshield, obscuring his view. He turned on the wipers, but they did nothing. The bastards ripped them off and started beating his hood with them. He pressed on, not wanting to stop, to allow them to get inside. Then, abruptly, violently, the car halted. He'd hit something. Maybe a building. Something that wasn't moving. Throwing the car into reverse, he backed away, feeling the car sway and lurch as he climbed over lumps that weren't there seconds before. The way they crunched and squealed, he assumed he was running over the vile creatures, and this brought him no small amount of satisfaction. When he could put the car back in drive and hit the gas, the car barely moved. It slid around slightly, but seemed to have no traction. Reverse gear didn't improve the situation. He craned the wheel, trying to pry himself loose from whatever was holding the car, picturing piles of the black shadows under his wheels. He briefly wondered what color their blood was. Suddenly the car jerked, but not in the direction he wanted. The nose lifted and fell, and he fell back into his seat. Then he noticed the creatures were no longer on his hood, and his view was clear again, but he wished it wasn't. He was staring into the silver eyes of the giant beast. It must have lifted the car off the ground. Up close, the headlights still refused to offer any illumination. It was like peering into a void. The monster growled at him. As a last-ditch effort, Andrew remembered the dial on the dashboard. He switched it, turned on the vehicle's four-wheel drive, and punched the gas. The car jerked backwards, jumping out of the beast's grip, and tore away. He felt the bumps and jolts as he ran over more of the silver-eyed children. Then the ground fell out from under him, and that was the last thing he remembered. Andrew awoke, sore and groggy, staring at the morning sky. He was still behind the wheel of his car, which no doubt was also sore and groggy. Surveying his surroundings, he discovered he'd driven down an embankment, some 30 or so feet below the parking lot behind the gas station, and was resting against some trees and bushes. Most importantly, none of the creatures were around. He'd survived the night. Not that they'd simply vanished. More words had been painted on the windshield. Dreading the new, terrifying message that awaited him, Andrew climbed out of the vehicle and inspected the damage first. The rear end was a wreck, and possibly beyond repair. Glass all over the car was either cracked or shattered completely. Scratches and dents marred the steel everywhere he looked, and red/brown paint was splashed all over the undercarriage. It dawned on him then that it wasn't paint, but blood. The creatures had been leaving him messages written in their own blood. He shuddered at the thought. Ignoring the lack of bodies that should have been littering the ground all around him, he marched to the front to read his new, bloody message. Find you, follow you, take you. Andrew swallowed hard, certain that his next encounter with the Shadow Children would be his last. Where they would take him, and for what purpose, he couldn't say. Nor did he want to find out. But why hadn't they taken him yet? Why were they tormenting him? Not that he was going to complain, he was still alive after all. But how much longer did he have? He pondered whether or not to abandon his car. Perhaps it was marked, and they followed their blood trail. Andrew decided instead to get help. He would take up the officer's suggestion from last night and report the incident. He might even rub it in the man's face. See what happened because of you? I could be dead right now. The incline up the embankment was steep, and he knew his car wouldn't have made it up the hill even if it would start. He had difficulty climbing it himself, stiff and bruised as he was. The walk back to town felt longer than it should have. He tried to devise a way to explain the situation that wouldn't make him sound crazy, but nothing sounded plausible. And of course, when he found the police station and recounted the events over the past few nights, he was met with raised eyebrows and skepticism. They went out to the scene of the crime and surveyed the damage, assuming alcohol was involved. But because they had no proof, they couldn't press charges. They also couldn't explain the stuff that looked like paint all over his car, nor did they seem inclined to. They called a wrecker and had the vehicle hauled out and taken to the nearest garage at his expense. The damage was indeed considerable and would take a week or longer to repair. Andrew wondered again if he shouldn't just write it off. He found an overpriced hotel with a vacancy the next town over and was more than happy to spend the night there, sleeping on the decision. From there, he was also finally able to phone his wife and tell her what had happened. Rational as she was, she maintained that there had to be a logical explanation for it all. She told him to call back when he had the repair cost estimate, but he would never get one. A comfy bed and secure locks and windows did little to erase the memories of the last few nights, and Andrew slept fitfully. He jolted awake every other hour, thinking he'd heard a scratching sound or hushed voices, but he remained alone. In the early morning, he was awakened by a phone call from the garage telling him there had been an accident. An hour and a taxi ride later, he arrived to find his precious car crushed, nearly folded in half, and leaning against a tree. It looked like a piece of paper one had crumpled and thrown away. No one had any idea how it could have possibly happened. The shop owner had arrived that morning and discovered the wreckage. But Andrew knew who had done it, though he kept it to himself. He wondered if they'd destroyed the car because they couldn't find him. Or did that mean it was over? He wasn't marked. Otherwise, they'd have come for him at the hotel. Was he free from their haunting voices and stalking silver eyes? Or were there more words written in blood on his windshield, waiting to be unearthed for him to read? He certainly wasn't going to be keeping his car now, no matter the case. The next day, Andrew hopped aboard a bus and headed back to his wife, eager to put everything behind him. He decided to work from home from now on.
A bead of sweat was tracing its way down Edward Midge's cheek behind the lank tendril of his long, greasy hair. Before he could wipe it away, It made its way down to his chin and dropped squarely on the cardboard cover of the vinyl record in his hands. "God damn, it's hot in here," Edward said to himself as he wiped up the drop with the heel of his hand. He looked up from the long wooden crate hand-labeled Punk and New Wave at the cashier standing behind the high counter. The cashier was frowning deeply at Edward. The store was small and dim. The lights were the kind of flickering fluorescent bulbs that obviously hadn't been changed in a long time. They buzzed at a frequency that was just barely audible. A large box fan propped open the front door, but it didn't seem to be helping much. The room was hot, and Edward moved his black-clad bulk around awkwardly between aisles, acutely aware that he was the only one in the store and that, even if he weren't, he would still stand out. The cashier gave Edward a perfunctory half-smile, then looked back down at his phone. He couldn't have been more than 25, easily Edward's junior by 10 years. Edward knew the type. Back when he had been picked up to play rhythm guitar by a thrash metal outfit out of Florida called Corpus Christi, skinny little guys like the cashier had been all the rage. They would get on stage in vintage cowboy shirts and their sisters' jeans and play what amounted to Trogs covers for a half hour and then sit at the bar, letting girls buy them drinks and ignoring the other bands. Edward had hated them. He still did, even though the label that had coaxed him out of his PhD program had folded 6 years before. Corpus Christi rebranded and kicked him out a couple of weeks later. Since then, Edward had applied to 4 different PhD programs. In the meantime, he had gotten himself a gig teaching Introduction to Writing at a community college. The cashier would ride his good looks and slim frame for as long as he could. "Like you wouldn't, fat boy," Edward thought bitterly. Edward made his way toward the door. There wasn't anything in here he didn't already have and needed. As he was rounding the corner, though, something caught his eye. There was a black corner of a record sleeve sticking out between 2 of the crates. With idle curiosity, he picked it up. The sleeve was a faded matte black, like a shirt that had been through the wash too many times. Slashed across the black were off-white lines that made up a vaguely sinister geometric design. It wasn't quite a pentagram, but it was close. Printed in a crabbed script across the bottom were the words, "De Vermis Mysterious." It would be easy to write the record off as some shock rock black metal copy, but there was something about how Edward felt holding it that wouldn't allow him to do that. He felt powerful. He felt connected with the world, like everything was finally in the same tempo, a quick staccato syncopation. Edward looked up at the counter. The cashier was gone. The birds and insects, and even the sounds of traffic outside, were all gone. The fluorescents still buzzed, and the fan hummed, but underneath it all there was a pregnant silence. There was a spectral, anticipatory quality in the air of the shop. It was a rural church on a Saturday afternoon. It was waiting to be filled with noise, music, people, and ritual. It was hungry for it. Edward shook his head, his long dark hair swishing gently. He set the record down. The sun filtering through the dust-caked, flyer-choked windows of the vinyl shop started to have the look of a golden late afternoon. 25 or 6 to 4, he thought. It was an old song, but the melody of it, the familiarity, comforted him. A cool, damp rag on a feverish forehead. Carefully, Edward set the black record down on the top of a bin marked Soundtracks, in the same lazy but somehow hurried writing as all the others. His eyes lingered on the thing, but he turned with some difficulty. Edward hurried and got out of the cramped, hot store and into the afternoon sun. He was a good 30 yards down the street and very near his beat-up, champagne-colored Toyota when he realized he was holding the record. He turned to return it, but thought better of it. It wasn't like there were any cameras or anything in there, and the skinny dude at the counter had almost surely not noticed. Edward crossed the last 20 or so yards of cracked concrete sidewalk to his car. A fat, red wasp crept across the windshield, staring up at Edward with its utterly otherworldly compound eyes, swiveling its head in an unnatural, robotic way. It cleaned its forelegs and then took unsteadily to the air. Edward spent most of his ride home irritably scanning through the radio for anything worthwhile. He was sorely disappointed. Everything seemed so banal and ordinary. Overplayed 90s hits gave way to uninspired pop, and it was all interspersed with the absolute nonsense that was drive-time radio banter. By the time he had surrendered and snapped off the radio in disgust and disappointment, Edward realized he was home and pulled into the parking lot in front of his building. It had been a long day, or at least as long as his days ever were. He had taught 3 freshman composition classes and graded papers in the sad, little communal office space reserved for adjuncts. It was a terrible room with the ceiling tiles bowing and sagging with age. The blinds were broken, and it was always dim in there. Some of his co-workers had taken to calling it the cave. Not to him, though. They rarely spoke to him. The thought of coming home to his cramped apartment had made his jaw clench up, so Edward had hit up the record store in an attempt to find something to listen to as he drank cheap beer on a gray couch that had not even come pre-assembled. Edward guessed he had at last found the record. De Vermis Mysterious was sitting on the cigarette-burned fabric of the passenger seat. Something about the way it laid there reminded Edward of a coiled snake. There was a lot of dangerous potential in it, wasn't there? The alien scratched design on the cover and the weird Latin-sounding name was like a warning. It was called aposematism in nature. It was like a coral snake whose stripes and bright colors let everyone know they were full of deadly venom. As he reached over and grabbed the record, Edward tried to shake the weird feeling of dread that was hanging over him. He was sweating again, even with his hair tied back in a messy ponytail. He sighed and lurched out of the sports sedan. At the top of the 3rd flight of stairs, Edward was breathing heavily. He could smell his body odor. He opened the door and walked directly to the fridge, kicking the front door closed with his heel. In the refrigerator, he rooted around until he found a cold Mexican lager. He crossed to the living room and took in his surroundings. It stank. It had since the day he moved in, despite his landlord's admonition that there was to be no smoking inside. The apartment was small and smelled like cigarettes and old cooking. There was a low scuffed coffee table with a dirty but empty ashtray across from the only couch. Propped against the sofa was his sunburst Takamine G series. It was in dire need of a restringing and setup. The only thing in the living room that didn't need replacing was his hi-fi system. It was a vintage model, about the size of a low sideboard table. The speakers were incredible, and the needle on the turntable had recently been replaced. Edward ran his hand across it lovingly. The wood was smooth and shiny. Edward put De Vermis Mysterious down and drew the vinyl out of the sleeve. The record itself was pretty average looking. It had a red label with the title printed in gold. Edward cracked the beer, took a slow, grateful sip, and set the record on the turntable. He turned up the volume and set the needle into the first groove. He turned the system on and shivered. Nothing happened besides a slight popping static. Edward frowned. The player had been working that morning. He had been listening to Sabbath Bloody Sabbath as he got ready for work. He flopped his 300-pound bulk down on the couch and drained his beer. His eyes shut, and the image of Claire flashed through his mind. She was wearing the mint green tank top she had been wearing in class on Monday. Her black hair, cropped right below her ears with Betty Page bangs, swirled as she laughed at what some stupid fucking jock kid sitting next to her said. Her heavy tits bounced a little. Edward was getting aroused. At some point, he fell asleep thinking about the girl. Edward opened his eyes. The hi-fi was playing. He crossed the room in an instant and stared at the record. It was De Vermis Mysterious, and it was running backward. The sound was something between 80s synth goth and 90s lo-fi black metal. It was incredible. He was aroused, more aroused than he had been in a long time. God damn, he was rigid. He heard someone talking from the kitchen. Edward turned as if deep underwater. There was pressure, resistance. As he turned, he saw the shimmering, distant mirage image of Claire standing on the precipice of a large cliff where his oven should have been.
Take me,
she whispered. Her voice sounded overly processed, like it had been recorded over and over on an analog device.
Take me.
Claire was naked now, her breasts heaving and her body slick with sweat. Her stomach and thighs glistened orange and red in the light of a setting sun. She was in the middle of an orgasm, moaning and twisting in exaggerated ecstasy. The look on her face, however, didn't seem to match. Perhaps it was a panic attack. The excessive fear in her eyes made him wonder, but there was no way to tell. Edward was beside her. He touched her skin. It collapsed, rotten, like old fruit. Edward screamed. The sound was feedback, a guitar with heavy distortion pressed against a half-stack amp. Edward's eyes shot open. His hair was plastered to his neck in wet hanks. De Vermis Mysterious was turning on the record player, the needle scratching impotently against the dead wax between the label and the grooves. Edward stopped the turntable. He put the needle gently in the last groove and began running the record backward. The music from his dream came bubbling out of the speakers with an insidious intensity. The screeching guitars and guttural vocals in some unknown language sent a thrill through him. He noticed the hair on his arm was standing on end. The feeling pumping through him was turning into pain. He pulled his hand away from the black disc, but it kept spinning. Edward sat down cross-legged on the floor. He stared so hard at the hi-fi, or maybe his eyes were closed, that he didn't notice when he wet himself. The afternoon sun was lying thickly on the carpet when Edward came to. He stumbled up and made his way to the shower. He reeked of urine, and his mouth was sour with bile. He had already missed his classes. Dressed and cleaned up, Edward arrived on campus with just 30 minutes left of his office hours. He sat in the parking lot with the air conditioner blasting, staring across the glittering asphalt at the building that shimmered in the August heat. He had lost almost a whole day. Somewhere inside, he knew the thought should trouble him, but it didn't. It all felt really distant, inconstant and wavering, like the buildings through the heat. The second or third track, it was hard to tell where one ended and the next began, of De Vermis Mysterious played on a loop in his head. There was a guttural chant perched on Edward's lips. It didn't seem to come from the record, but he had not known it before. There were drums behind it, booming and echoing before men had known not to play certain rhythms. Edward knew with certainty that certain melodies, rhythms, time signatures, and words came from somewhere else. The scales were all wrong. There was a pulsing dissonance in between halftones that crept up the spinal cord and lodged themselves in the deep, dark animal brain, hidden beneath the centuries of domestication. When Claire exited the English building and began making her way through the parking lot, Edward's eyes focused again. He took a ragged breath. He tracked her between the cars. She was wearing jean shorts that hugged her hips tightly and a light blue spaghetti strap top. Edward wet his lips with his tongue and rolled down his window. "Miss Watson?" Edward called. Claire's head snapped around at the sound of her name. She walked toward the car, confused.
Dr. Mitch?
Edward winced. "Professor," he corrected. She had crossed to the car and was standing with her textbook, an asinine collection of example essays he had been required to assign, pressed protectively against her chest. Edward looked around. The parking lot was surprisingly, fortuitously, empty. Edward struggled up out of the driver's seat to stand in front of the slight young student. "Do it now," a voice in his head said. He wondered what it was exactly, feeling the knowledge just beyond his mental grasp.
Sorry.
Claire said with a quick glance around. If she noticed that the world around them had emptied out, she didn't recognize the danger.
Why were you not in class today? Are you sick?
"Now, Edward." The voice was more insistent. Something about it made Edward think of someone holding a heavy door open.
We all wrote our names down on this piece of paper for attendance. I have it here. I didn't really expect to, see you, I guess.
The girl fumbled around, pulling a piece of loose-leaf paper out of her book that was creased and folded meticulously. The heavy door in Edward's mind was closing. "That's very responsible of you," Edward said. The girl smiled, extending the paper to him. "Now!" the voice hissed in an urgent, demanding tone that made Edward's teeth hurt, like he had gulped freezing water. Edward smiled at Claire, only just then realizing he had been holding a hefty claw hammer. It was the black-handled one from his junk drawer he had inherited from his permanently disappointed father and had used to hang pictures and, one time, fix the bathroom cabinet. The weight of it was nice in his hand. "I love you," Edward said. It was true. He did. He felt terrible for what was about to happen. Claire's eyes went wide, and Edward couldn't be sure if she noticed the hammer or not. Either way, there was no time to waste. He brought the hammer down hard, right between her eyes, which Edward saw for the first time had tiny flecks of hazel in with the green. They really were striking. Claire moaned and dropped to the concrete, the book flopping out of her limp arms. The paper sawed back and forth through the air toward the ground. As she collapsed, her head struck the ground hard enough to bounce. Her feet jumped and skittered on the pavement. Her mouth was moving, but she wasn't making words. There was a semicircular rip in her skin between her manicured eyebrows, just below her bangs. It was already bleeding badly. Edward brought the hammer down again, causing a loud pop underneath the dull thump as her pretty, wide eyes rolled back in her head. Her body was still. Edward scooped her up in his arms, easily managing her weight. He opened the back driver's side door and tossed the girl inside before slamming the door and inspecting the hammer. There was blood and skin stuck to the head. Edward licked it clean as he climbed in and started the car. The door in his mind shut, and around him, life seemed to have restarted none the wiser. Edward pulled out of the parking lot and snapped on the radio. Static hissed at him like a cornered animal. In the back seat, Claire moaned. Her eyelids fluttered, but remained closed. Good, Edward thought. She's not dead yet. By the time he had gotten back to his apartment, Edward had given up on the radio. He was riding with the AC up and the windows down, humming a tune from his dream. As he pulled into his usual space, he noticed no one about, and the blinds on every window he could see were down and closed. Everything was going his way today. It was a cheery thought, and he grinned. Edward bounded up the metal and concrete stairs to his apartment, effortlessly buoyed by a boyish excitement he hadn't felt in years. He threw the door wide and carried Claire across the threshold in his arms, a groom and bride on their wedding night. Edward laid Claire on the couch and turned on the record player. It was running forward again. He sat down across from the prone form of the girl. De Vermis Mysterious began playing. Edward was shaking with excitement. Claire opened her eyes and screamed. Edward clamped a hand over her mouth. He needed her to be quiet. How was she supposed to hear the music if she wouldn't be quiet? By the time the record was finished and ready to be flipped, Claire was dead. Edward had strangled her as the hi-fi system drowned out her feeble pleas and promises. There was blood on his arms and face from her nails. They were both drenched in sweat. Just a little lover's spat, he thought, laughing under his breath. Edward stared down at the corpse. Claire was a thing now. A dirty, bloody thing that had scratched at him and screamed and very nearly ruined his listening experience. He reached down and touched the skin just below her chin, delicately this time. The flesh there was puffy and blackened from his thumbs. What a poor little thing. Why couldn't she have just been quiet? Edward flipped the record and stood over the prone form of the girl. He stroked her stomach, flat but soft and beginning to cool. Her skin was smooth as he bent and pressed his lips to hers. There was no movement. He knew there wouldn't be, but he had held out hope that somehow the record could give him that too. He kissed her again, but felt nothing. Disgusted, he rolled the body off the couch and took its place. He fell asleep listening to the scratch on the needle, heading for the blood-red label. Edward woke up in the bedroom. It wasn't his bedroom, or at least he didn't think it was. It must have been, though. There was a picture of his parents on the nightstand, and his degrees framed on the wall. But the room was much bigger than his apartment, and cleaner. The furniture wasn't new, per se, but it wasn't the hand-me-downs that had previously populated his place. The wood of the short nightstand and the long, low dresser was dark, almost black. The smell of someone making coffee and frying bacon drifted in through the open bedroom door. Edward swung his feet out of bed, feeling the carpet between his toes. The carpet was thick and cream-colored, like in a real house. It wasn't the stained industrial stuff he was used to in every apartment he had ever rented. Edward stood and stretched. He groaned.
Baby?
Came a woman's voice from somewhere across the house. It bounced around Edward's mind, struggling to connect to clear memory. Claire? But it couldn't be. She was dead. He knew that. Or was it all some sort of dream? Edward walked out of the bedroom and down a short hallway he similarly didn't recognize. There were paintings on the walls, abstract color studies. They weren't bad, but they weren't by an especially trained hand either. Did Claire paint? He didn't know. They had rarely talked about anything other than her grade or the lecture of the day. Did she do that first essay on Picasso? Maybe she did. Or perhaps that was the blonde girl who sat in the back. Claire came into view in the kitchen doorway, wearing his faded Melvin's shirt and a pair of pink bikini underwear that just barely peeked out from beyond the bottom hem of the shirt as she stretched up to open the spice cabinet. Edward froze in the doorway. The day before came rushing back to him. The hollow, wet thump of the hammer. The feel of the strained tendons of Claire's neck under his fingers. And the sound of the record playing as she gasped and gurgled and begged. She had begged.
I'll do anything!
She had cried. Anything but be quiet. Sorry, no extra credit this time, he thought, laughing silently.
Good morning, Sleeping Beauty.
Claire said as she turned and saw him. She smiled. It was a truly stunning expression. Edward smiled and sat down at the table. Claire came over with 2 plates piled high with scrambled eggs, thick-cut bacon, and a potato and onion hash. Edward ate heartily, smiling dumbly at Claire between bites. She smiled back. They didn't talk. It was rude to speak with a full mouth. She truly was a great cook. There was a flair to the food and precision that spoke of someone who took great pride in any form of expression. Edward loved her for it. As the food dwindled, Edward noticed that the silence in the room was almost complete. He couldn't hear the roaring, ocean-like surge of the interstate like he could at what he was now thinking of as the old place. Claire's fork scraped her plate, and Edward winced. He could hear her chewing, and it set his teeth on edge. He swallowed hard. "Honey," he said, trying out the pet name for size. Claire didn't react, so he knew he called her that often here in this home. Did she live here? She certainly seemed to know where everything was. "Do you think we could put on some music? It's a little quiet in here."
Of course, baby.
Claire replied with her big, shining smile. She hopped up and crossed the room, her hips swaying gently from side to side in a way that Edward had always appreciated as she left his stupid little class. The girl crossed to the hi-fi system, seemingly the only thing left over from the old apartment. She picked up the familiar faded record sleeve, De Vermis Mysterious. Only it didn't look so faded. The cardboard was glossy and new-looking. "Not that one," Edward said quickly.
I bet you love this one.
Edward cocked his head. Maybe they listen to it all the time. "You're right, honey. I guess I do." There was a moment of pregnant silence before the first note. The first blast of feedback and distortion came pouring through the speakers, filling the room like smoke. He grabbed the long-bladed knife that Claire had used to cut the vegetables. Edward reveled in it, breathed it in, and swallowed it. He hid it down by his side and crossed the room to stand behind the girl and smell her hair. It was lightly floral. There was a hint of husky vanilla coming from the nape of her neck. He leaned in, brushing her cheek with his lips as he thrust the blade in between the second and third ribs in her chest. Claire screamed and pushed away from the knife, which only drove her deeper into Edward's arms. He wrapped her up tightly, feeling the squirm of her surprisingly muscular body against him. She really was sexy. In a flash, he struck 3 more times. The initial resistance, followed by a sudden give, made his stomach feel like he was falling. Claire began to gurgle and sputter as blood filled her lungs. 2 more strikes and it was over. He lay down on the big couch and listened to the record, drowsy and satisfied. The body crumpled in front of the record player didn't move. "I love you, honey." Edward rolled to face the plush back of the couch. There were days, whole weeks even, when he didn't kill her. He would live the life the record had given him, eating, drinking, and making love to Claire. Often they were married. Usually, although not always, they had met in class. Most of the time, he was fully tenured and lectured on music at the university. Claire called him Doc in those lives. Always, though, his inevitable bad luck would creep back in. He would show up to work drunk or try to seduce another student and get himself fired. If things went on too long at home, the tedium of everyday life would creep in. He and Claire would argue. He would forget chores. He would have to reset. One morning, after a night spent beating Claire to death with a heavy lamp, he woke up sore. It wasn't entirely unusual. He had often woken up with the little scrapes and bruises from the day or night before still lingering into the new world. Claire wasn't in bed. That was fine. The one thing that seemed most consistent was that the girl was an early riser. He padded from a king-sized bed in what looked to be a professionally decorated room into the master bathroom. It was all white tile and shining brass fixtures. "You've got a lot of scratch this time. It wouldn't be too bad to hang out here for a while." Edward stood over the toilet, popped his spine with his hands pressed to the small of his back, and took a piss. Passing a mirror, he noticed that his hair and beard were much more coiffed and trimmed than usual, professionally styled in a precise way. His gut, which was always big, looked smaller. Edward patted it appreciatively. Perhaps he had found a life he wouldn't want to trade. Edward found his way into the living room. It was breathtaking. The room was decked out in black and white furniture and accents that looked expensive in the modernist, subtle way that truly quality pieces often do. Professional oil paintings were hanging up on the walls. They had Claire's flair for color and bold brushstrokes. The paintings were much more studied and experienced, though. Time to perfect it, Edward thought. We must be so happy here. "Honey?" he called, looking around the room. There was no answer. His eyes swept the room, settling on the only thing out of place, Edward's old hi-fi system. Claire was sitting in front of it, with a large pair of headphones on and a record sleeve loosely tucked into her left hand. She was heavily pregnant, but wore it with a glowing grace that Edward found awe-inspiring and erotic at the same time. She smiled widely at Edward and let the record sleeve drop to the floor. It was De Vermis Mysterious, a tattered old copy. His copy, Edward noted, had not looked like that in a long time. Edward's blood ran cold. There was no way of telling how long she had been listening. God damn it. Maybe he could escape. He didn't know the house. There was no apparent front door. She knew the house, though. She always did. She stared at him, her eyes flashing. The lives, the worlds, the murders. They were all right there in the depths of her knowing eyes. And they were deep. So deep they felt like the crushing depths of a dark ocean trench. There was no light there, and no air. Sweat made its way down the back of his neck. He swatted at it. Claire, for her part, sat coiled, a venomous beauty about her.
Good morning, sleeping beauty,
Claire said as she raised her right hand, leveling the revolver at his face. Honey, please, Edward pleaded, holding his palms up to her. Could he talk her out of it? She ever talk you out of it, fat boy? Where would he go? Would she wake up next to him in the kitchen making breakfast? Of course not, said a chuckling voice in Edward's head. There were only so many grooves in a record he knew. He looked across at the turntable as the needle finished off the first side. It scratched, skipping into the dead wax. Claire had not moved the revolver or taken off the headphones. The hair on her arm was standing on end. The last thing that passed through Edward's mind was how the morning sunlight made Claire's green and hazel-flecked eyes so goddamn pretty. They were so sharp and pretty, it hurt. Claire pulled the trigger. Edward wasn't even alive long enough to hear the report. A mist of blood and brain splattered against a canvas covered in bold swipes of yellows. The body fell back against the wall in a broken, useless heap. Claire stood, turned the record over, placed the needle into the first groove, and turned up the volume. She sat back down on the plush carpet, crossing her long legs and leaning back against the side of the record player. She sighed and rubbed her stomach, full of life and hope. She closed her eyes and dreamed of a better world.
Turn the car around.
Don had just settled into his relaxed, long drive posture. Huh?
Just turn around.
Marjorie's tone was urgent.
We need to go back to the motel.
Why? It's miles to the next exit.
Sorry, I left my makeup kit in the bathroom.
She was embarrassed.
We need to get there before the cleaning crew picks it up.
He groaned. Can't you just buy more?
Have you priced cosmetics lately? It's a couple of $100 at least. Not to mention the fancy case your mother gave me for my birthday.
They were back at the motel in 20 minutes. Don stayed in the car, listening to the radio, while Marjorie finagled a key from the disgruntled desk attendant. She raced down the hall and breathed a sigh of relief when she saw the unmade bed, the untouched room. She retrieved her case from the bathroom and glanced around to make sure they hadn't left anything else. That's when she saw the bear. A teddy bear, perched regally on a pillow, leaned nonchalantly against the bed's fake headboard. How could it have gotten there? Someone must have come in and left it. The cleaning crew? But the room hadn't been touched. She picked it up and looked into its happy face. It seemed oddly familiar, comforting. She couldn't resist hugging the little thing. It felt so good that for a moment, she forgot Don was waiting in the car. She couldn't just leave it. She took the bear with her as she walked back to the front desk, intending to leave it at reception. Nobody was there. She banged on the bell, but no one appeared. On impulse, she dropped the key next to the computer and walked out the door with the bear. "What's that?" asked Don. He started the car and pulled out of the parking lot.
My makeup case and a teddy bear.
"Yeah, I can see that. Where'd you get him?"
Why him? She looks quite feminine to me.
She held the bear next to her face and kissed it. "Well, excuse me. Where'd you get her?" He glanced over and shook his head as his wife gave the bear an extravagant hug.
Found her in the room waiting for me, and I couldn't just leave her there.
"Oh no, of course not," he said sarcastically. "But right now, some little girl is crying her eyes out. Mother's probably on the cleaning crew."
Don't be mean. The room hadn't been touched.
So the bear walked in on her own? He glanced at his wife doubtfully.
Whatever. She's mine now, and we'll give her a good home.
"What do you mean, we? This is on you."
Look at it this way. I rescued her. She's underage, and they were probably forcing her to clean toilets.
And Marjorie was off on one of her flights.
I think we've stumbled onto a child slavery ring. The local law is on our tail now. Wants to nab us for child abduction and crossing state lines. Have you heard of the Mann Act? We're partners in a federal crime, Don. So romantic. Like Bonnie and Clyde.
Jeez. You and your imagination. Anyway, it's not a child. Both their grins faded. They were silent for many miles. They stopped for lunch at a McDonald's and Marjorie brought the bear inside. Don shook his head. "Marjorie, I've always said you're not afraid of what people think, but sometimes...
It gets hot in the car. We can't leave her in there.
Couple $100 worth of makeup is melting, but this teddy bear won't survive?
Men don't understand.
How right you are. They sat in a booth and ate their Big Macs and fries. The bear sat next to Marjorie in the booth. At least she didn't put it in a high chair, he thought, or try to feed it. As though reading his mind, she held a fry up to its mouth. She turned to Don's open-mouthed stare and laughed uproariously.
You should see your face.
She roared. Don shook his head. Marjorie, darling, you worry me sometimes. She was still laughing as they walked back to the car. It was blazing hot inside the car, and they opened all the doors while Don ran the air conditioner at max. He studied the map on his phone, checked his trip notes, and calculated how far it was to the first national park. In their little family, Don was the plotting planner, the get-it-done engineer. He'd been working on the itinerary for a month, obviously plotting out their route, researching the highlights of each park, the distance between them, and the best places to stay. No detail was too small. They each had their own way of dealing with the loss, and this was his. Now he could check off the first leg of the trip, the 2-day drive from Fort Worth, and start working through the major milestones on his list. Over the next 2 weeks, they would visit 9 national parks: Bryce Canyon, Great Basin, Arches, Zion, Mesa Verde, Rocky Mountain, Canyonlands, Capitol Reef, and Great Sand Dunes. It was a daunting schedule, but Don was confident they could do it. When he looked up, he noticed Marjorie doing something in the back seat. He turned to see her pulling the seat belt around the bear. There's probably a Walmart down the road. Why don't we stop and buy a car seat? Maybe a sippy cup. She laughed.
Don't be silly. I don't want her rolling around, maybe falling on the floor.
She snapped the buckle into place and slammed the door shut.
Doesn't she look cute?
Don glanced back at the bear, who stared at him with its fixed grin. Oh yeah, real cute. Marjorie climbed in the front seat, smiling.
Come on, lighten up. It's just for fun.
He sighed and started the car. As he pulled onto the highway, he could feel the bear's eyes on the back of his head. So, what should we call him?
Her?
She reminded him.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that.
They began running through possibilities. It was the kind of game people play on long car trips, and Marjorie's free-ranging mind was good at it. When Don tried to change the subject to their destination or to point out the foothills just appearing in the distance, Marjorie would respond half-heartedly, then suddenly interject a new name.
How about Beauregard? Beauregard Bear.
She said brightly. You mean the Confederate general? Jeff Sessions' middle name? No way! Don decided to humor her. He countered with, You like Beastie Bear? Like my favorite band? Back when?
I'd rather call her the Beartles. Or the Bear 52s. John Bear Jovi? Kurt Cobain.
And on it went. They crept slowly up the mountain, ascending through a series of winding switchbacks. The view was spectacular. Marjorie took the bear from the back seat and held it up to the window. The bear's expression did not change, and she sighed. Don kept his eyes on the road. Marjorie took out her hairbrush and began combing the bear's fur.
She likes this. It was getting mussed up with all the handling.
She examined the bottom of its foot.
Oh my God.
Don glanced over. What? She had her hand on her chest, staring with surprise at the bottom of the bear's foot.
That mark, see it?
He glanced over quickly, but saw only a smear. I can't look now. I'm trying to stay on the damned road. He swerved sharply around another switchback. What is it?
There's a mark on its foot. My old bear, the one I had as a kid, she had the same mark.
And what's it say? Made in China? Like everything else we own?
No, it's with a pen. I marked my bear that same way with my initials, and it kind of got smeared after a while, just like this one.
So what's it say?
Hard to tell.
She held the foot in the sun and squinted.
Now you'll know I'm crazy, and I think it's MJ, my initials.
Don's stomach knotted up, then relaxed. She had to be joking. Momentarily distracted, he drifted across the center line. A pickup appeared around the next switchback, going downhill too fast. The driver blared his horn and gestured as Don swerved back into his lane. Shit, he swore under his breath. When he turned to Marjorie, she was holding her hands over the bear's ears.
Don't curse in front of her,
she said, oblivious to the near miss. Fucking Christ, he said. Look, I'm really getting tired of this, Marjorie. She looked hurt and turned toward the window. They were silent for the next hour. She kept the bear in her lap, but held it up to the window from time to time and whispered into its ear. Don lay on one bed at the hotel that night, studying the maps and brochures he'd scattered about, while Marjorie lay on the other bed. She was holding the bear in one arm, phone in the other, scrolling through texts and emails.
Mother wants me to call her.
She sighed.
I guess I'd better. It could take a while. You know Mom,
she said, putting the phone to her ear. Don tried to tune out the conversation, but his ears perked up when Marjorie mentioned the bear.
Oh, guess what? I found the most darling little teddy bear. Somebody must have left it in the motel where we stayed 2 nights ago. He's been riding along with us, and Don and I have been showing him the sights.
Don gritted his teeth. That would be you, not me, he thought.
And the funniest thing is, you know how I made a mark on the foot of my bear? Well, I found that same mark on this bear. It's smeared, but it looks just like what I wrote. You know, my initials.
As Marjorie listened, Don forced his attention back to the brochure on Bryce Canyon, the next day's destination. His concentration was interrupted by Marjorie's change in tone.
No, that's wrong. Of course I did. How could you forget?
Another long pause. Then her voice rose in volume.
Mother, don't be ridiculous. I did have a bear. That's why this is so weird. Is something going on with your memory?
He glanced over and saw his wife's wrinkled brow.
I'm not insulting you.
She was shaking her head, and he thought her lip was trembling.
I know. Kids remember things differently, but I had that bear for years until Dad...
Minutes later, she hung up with a chilly,
"Goodbye, Mother."
Marjorie sat and stared at the blank TV screen while she stroked the bear with her right hand. What was that all about? He asked.
Nothing,
she said. Come on. You never talk to your mother that way. What did she say? Marjorie wouldn't look at him.
She said...
Marjorie paused to catch her breath.
She said I never had a bear. My father refused to let me have one, and he said it created dependency, like sucking your thumb.
Oh, wow. Don shook his head. That sounds like the general, all right. The old guy was a bit rigid, wasn't he? Don thought the word rigid was charitable. When he and Marjorie went on dates, Don would have to meet beforehand with her father and describe his exact plans for the evening. Fortunately, Don's careful planning and earnest manner met with the general's grudging approval. Nevertheless, Don always left their house bathed in sweat. One night, the very night he'd planned to propose, the old man had a massive coronary and died.
Mother's wrong. I did have a bear, and it looked just like ours.
You were a kid, and she was an adult. How could she forget that? Maybe you just imagined it. She shook her head, but her normally serene face had a troubled expression. She grabbed the remote and turned on the TV, then wrapped both arms around the bear and hugged it tightly. She soon fell asleep, and they spoke no more that night. Over the next 2 weeks, they kept to the schedule and rolled through all 9 national parks. Don's bucket list, work plan in project management terms, was to visit all 62 national parks. They had honeymooned at Yosemite and visited the big ones in subsequent years, including Yellowstone and Grand Canyon. They were set to start on the lesser-known parks when the baby came, temporarily shelving plans. Afterward, Don revived the plan as a means of escape. This trip to the western parks, all relatively close together, would knock off 9 more, as he put it. On the 14th day, even Don had to admit to scenic exhaustion. Marjorie, disciplined from youth by her father not to object, had endured the marathon stoically. She never complained about stopping for the next spectacular rock pillar, bottomless chasm, or mountain view, but Don began to feel guilty about putting his wife through his relentless itinerary. They had learned to cut each other considerable slack after the loss, and he in turn held his tongue as she brushed the bear's fur, chatted with it, and held it up to the window for each new sight. Nevertheless, as the trip wore on, his patience grew thin. They never settled on a name. She simply called it Bear. The last park was Great Sand Dunes, encompassing 30 square miles and described in the brochure as a sandbox of epic proportions. For sure, it was spectacular and amazing, but as they pulled out of the parking lot, Don felt jaded. He regretted they would end the tour on that weak note. As they began the 2-hour drive to Taos, he made a reluctant admission. 9 parks, 14 days. Thank God we'll never have to do that again. They both laughed, breaking the chill.
Aw, Donnie, you loved it. For about 8 days, anyway.
I'd say 10. Okay, 9. The last 4 have been a slog. I love the parks, so I hated when they began to look the same. The same visitor center, same exhibits, same magnificent scenery.
Well, Bear loved it. She never got tired.
Mentioning the bear chilled the conversation. Over the next few days, his feelings had alternated between concern and annoyance. Sure, kids could have imaginary friends, but grown-ups? His own wife? Marjorie had carried the bear into every roadside bathroom, curio shop, and restaurant. In shops, they usually browsed separately, and often he'd look down an aisle and see her showing some little trinket, a colored stone, a piece of jewelry, to the bear. It always sat on her lap or at the favored spot next to her in the booth in restaurants. Outside Taos, they stopped for lunch at a Denny's, probably their 10th of the trip. Someone had left a high chair next to their table, and Marjorie automatically placed the bear in it. Don shuddered, but said nothing. Minutes later, a blue-haired, tattooed waitress arrived.
Should I take away the chair, or would you like a kid's menu for the little beast?
Her tone was decidedly snarky. Yeah, take the damn thing, he said curtly. He grabbed the bear and tossed it into the booth next to Marjorie, who looked shocked, and sat it up carefully beside her.
Don, you could have hurt her,
said Marjorie, as she smoothed the bear's fur. He caught the waitress's eye as her pierced brow rose. Inside joke, he said sheepishly. That evening, in Taos, they treated themselves to a lavish meal at a fancy restaurant with white tablecloths, heavy silverware, and overly attentive waiters. I think we deserve this, laughed Don after his first glass of champagne. They held up their glasses in a toast to our healths and to national parks. God bless Teddy Roosevelt. Marjorie held the glass up.
To Teddy, for giving us the teddy bear.
She swung her glass round to the bear.
And to the day we found our sweet little bear, the most wonderful darling anyone could wish for.
Don said nothing and quickly drained his glass. He poured himself another and another. He tried to change the subject, but their conversational well had run dry. Across the table, Marjorie gazed lovingly at the bear and smoothed its fur, and the bear stared at Don. The next morning, Don opened his aching eyes and found himself nose to nose with the bear. It was hangover time, complete with waves of nausea and a roaring headache. He shoved it roughly off the bed. Then he reached down to retrieve it and laid it carefully next to Marjorie. He did not want to start their next to last day on a sour note. He took a scalding hot shower, hoping in vain the steaming spray would magically ease his pain, but even pressing his forehead hard against the tile wall gave no relief. Toweling off, he found his wife still asleep, clutching the bear tight with both arms. He felt a wave of jealousy toward the beast as he'd come to think of it. That waitress had called it right, he thought. He cheered up when he remembered the day's destination, the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge, the massive steel deck arch bridge that crossed the Rio Grande River 10 miles outside of Taos. It was their last stop, and he'd been looking forward to it for the entire trip. His interest was partly professional as a civil engineer, but the personal connection was its real attraction. His uncle, a retired engineer who had inspired Don to enter the profession, worked on the bridge as a young man. He talked about those 2 years as the highlight of his career. Completed in 1965 at the height of 600 feet, it was one of the 10 highest bridges in the United States. It had a magnificent view, and Don's engineering organization had named it the most beautiful steel bridge in Materials Performance magazine. Neither of them was in the mood for breakfast, so they left the motel and headed out Highway 64 for the 15-minute drive. As they passed the airport, his excitement grew. He chatted merrily about the bridge's cantilever truss structure and how it had recently received a year-long facelift. Marjorie nodded gravely. Minutes later, they were on the bridge itself. He slowed down, glancing back and forth from the road to the gleaming girders and trusses until he heard the blare of a car horn behind him. The minivan driver was honking at him to speed up, and he suppressed his annoyance and urged the car from 20 to 30. The visitors' parking lot was on the other side of the bridge. He turned in and found a spot across from a line of vendors. He was annoyed when the impatient minivan parked next to him, too close, and its doors swung open to disgorge a pair of yelling children. He had to wait until the heavy-set woman laboriously climbed out and closed her door before he could open his. Marjorie was standing at the back of the car when he finally got out. The minivan driver was less than 10 feet away, an obese man with a shaved head in a tank top. "You know, you didn't have to honk the horn like that," said Don crossly. He rarely said anything confrontational, but his headache had not abated. Why the hell did I say that? He wondered. Surprisingly, the burly man apologized.
Sorry about that. The wife reached over and pressed the horn. She's been fighting with the boys all morning.
Okay, no problem. He felt embarrassed. As if on cue, the woman in the pink stretchy shorts began yelling at her two boys and slapped both of them, one of whom began crying.
"Cry, baby,"
said the other, which earned him a second slap. Marjorie turned to Don, holding the bear to her chest.
I hate for our bear to see anything like that. It scares her.
She hugged it tighter and spoke into its ear.
We'd never do anything like that to you, don't worry.
Look, well, let's wait a while, said Don, until they're gone. They strolled toward the line of vendors. The row of pickup trucks and makeshift racks and tables seemed a permanent fixture along one side of the parking lot. They browsed through racks of turquoise and silver bracelets and necklaces, velvet paintings and tinkling wind chimes. Taciturn Native Americans sat in the shade of their pickups and stared at nothing. Marjorie picked out a small beaded necklace, and much to Don's chagrin, hung it around the neck of the bear.
Doesn't she look good in it?
Mortified, Don handed a $5 bill to the woman, who remained impassive as she fished around in her cash box for the dollar change. I guess she's seen everything from us pale faces now, he thought. Pedestrian walkways lined both sides of the bridge, and he guided Marjorie across the road, hoping the family from the minivan had taken the nearby side. Outposts had been constructed on the walkway so tourists could walk out and look straight down to the Rio Grande, a dizzying 600 feet below. Don, Marjorie, and the bear peered over the chest-high bars, standing next to a call box marked Crisis Hotline. There is hope. Make the call. He'd read the bridge was famous for jumpers because it had no suicide barrier. Just then, the same two bratty boys ran up, jostled them aside, and stuck their heads through the bars. They began spitting vigorously into the depths, then picked up rocks and hurled them into the gorge. "Don't do that!" Don yelled. They both looked up at him, defiant and unafraid. Clearly, they were so used to being yelled at that Don's reprimand had little effect. The older one leaned casually against the suicide call box, smirking. They might have to talk me out of a double homicide, he thought sardonically. Behind him came a hostile voice.
"I just about had it with you, Buster."
It was the obese man with his wife.
"You can't talk to my kids that way."
Don looked him in the eye. "It's against the law to throw anything from the bridge," he said, "and if it's not a law, it should be." The wife glared at him.
They're just boys. If you know what's good for you, you'll leave them alone.
To her kids, she said,
Come on, sweet things. You leave that mean man be.
The parting shot from the man stung.
"If you had any kids of your own, you'd know better."
Don felt his face grow hot. The boys smirked and each spat once more through the barriers before they backed off and skipped away. Don turned to look down at the river, trying to regain a bit of calm, serene wonder he'd expected to feel. Over his shoulder, he heard the older boy yell,
That lady's talking to her teddy bear. She must be crazy.
They began chanting.
Crazy, crazy, crazy.
As they ran down the walkway. Don felt sick to his stomach, but Marjorie was unfazed. She stroked the bear and cooed into its ear.
Don't worry, Daddy's just a little upset.
The next moment was lost in a blur of rage. He snatched the bear from Marjorie's arms and hurled it over the bars and down into the gorge. It descended as a whirling blur, falling and spinning into the void. A horrendous animal scream erupted from his wife as she threw out her arms and placed her foot on the lower rail as though to jump after the bear.
Marjorie, no! God, what are you doing?
Don grabbed her waist and held her as she continued to scream and flail, as her voice hoarsened and turned into uncontrollable sobs. People turned and stared. Don tried to hold her and apologize, but she flung off his arms and rushed away from him. She marched back toward the car, and he had no choice but to let her go. He was shocked at what he'd done. His annoyance had evaporated, replaced by a terrible shame.
Why did I do that? I'm a fucking idiot.
Blessedly, the minivan was gone by the time they got back to the car. He beeped to unlock the door, and she jumped in.
Marjorie, I'm sorry. I don't know what made me...
His apology was cut short as she slammed the door shut. She cried back to Taos. As they left the town limits, heading south toward Fort Worth, Marjorie stopped crying.
Stop the car,
she said harshly.
What for? Do you want a drink or something?
Just stop the car. Open the trunk.
He did as he was told. Marjorie opened her suitcase and brought 2 pill bottles back with her. He watched her gulp down a Xanax and an Ambien.
It's probably not a good idea to mix those,
he whispered.
Shut up,
she said. It was an 11-hour drive back to Fort Worth, planned for 2 days, but Don wouldn't have stopped for anything. He drove like a man possessed, pausing only for snack food and bathroom breaks. Marjorie dozed for the first few hours, twitching convulsively in her sleep. He felt awful when she seemed to be reaching for the bear, but her arms found only empty air. It had been less than 2 months since they had lost their baby girl to sudden infant death syndrome. SIDS. Crib death was the silent fear of many new parents, and they had experienced its full horror. Each had coped in their own way, and Don's outlet had been his obsessive planning for the trip. Marjorie was different. Except for the Xanax and an antidepressant she soon stopped taking, she'd simply cried. She seemed to welcome the trip, and Don admired her resilience. When the trip began, he let himself hope her old, buoyant self had returned. 4 hours later, she spoke. It startled him because he hadn't realized she was awake.
I'm sorry about how I acted,
she said. Don felt a wave of relief and spoke in a rush.
No, it's all my fault, Margie. There's no excuse from what I did. That bear meant a lot to you and...
No, I shouldn't have gotten so attached. It was sick. It started out as a game, but I took it too far and I couldn't stop. It was wrong.
Honey, it wasn't wrong. She began crying again.
I miss our baby.
She wailed. Don pulled over to the side of the road. He was crying too. They held each other and sobbed. It was after midnight when he pulled into their garage. Marjorie stumbled into the house while Don struggled with the suitcases. He was dragging both of them through the living room when he heard a terrifying shriek from down the hall. He dropped everything and ran to the bedroom. Marjorie was laughing and sobbing, hugging something to her chest. When she saw Don, she unfolded her arms and held them out. It was the bear.
She came back. She came back to me.
Her words were lost in a torrent of hysterical sobs. Don felt the world spinning as he leaned against the wall and slid to the floor. Her crying never abated. It was after 5 when he finally took her to the hospital, clutching the bear. The doctor sedated her and insisted on holding her for observation. He sent Don home to get some badly needed sleep. The house felt deadly empty. The bedroom, worse. When Don pulled back the covers, he found a note that had slipped between the bed and the bedside table. It was from Marjorie's mother, Doris. She had a key to the house and had watered their plants while they were gone. He read the note with shaking hands. Dear Marge, so sorry about our last phone call. You were right. You did get a bear once. This bear from your Aunt Nancy. I remember now that your father immediately took it away from you. Something about dependency. How you cried. I found it in the attic trunk last night, where he had hid it so many years ago. I wish he hadn't done it, but that's the way he was. Love, Mom. The lavish banquet that had been so expertly laid out on the long, elegant refractory table before me could only be described as perfect. Truly, utterly perfect. It was the most sublimely archetypal Thanksgiving dinner that I can imagine. The table was draped in a red velvet cloth and adorned with white doilies. All the cutlery and serving dishes were hand-polished sterling silver. All the drinking goblets were dazzling prismatic crystal, and all the dining plates were gold-trimmed antique porcelain, passed down from generation to generation, longer than anyone could say for certain. Despite all of that, the food itself still managed to be the most coveted thing before me. It was still steaming hot, its beckoning aroma wafting upwards and unbidden towards me, as though trying to lure me in. There was garlic mashed potatoes, mashed turnip, buttered peas and carrots, creamed asparagus, stuffing, giblet gravy, hot rolls, sweet bread, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, and a literal cornucopia overflowing with fresh fruit and candy. And of course, the centerpiece was a stuffed turkey, the biggest one I had ever seen.
Tantalizing, isn't it?
The girl in the dress asked from the opposite end of the table. I knew who she was, and I knew her name, but I shall only be referring to her as the girl in the dress. It was both proper and expected that I would be accompanied by a girl in a dress upon such an occasion, and as far as I was concerned, it could have been any girl in a dress. How I wished she was just some random girl in a dress.
Tantalizing in the sense that your situation is reminiscent of the mythical Tantalus. Wouldn't you agree?
The girl in the dress continued, this time failing to suppress a sadistic little smirk. I wasn't sure how long it'd been since I had last eaten, only that I was ravenously hungry. Probably the hungriest I had been in my entire life. And yet, the sumptuous feast before me was just out of reach, as the girl in the dress had bound me to the chair with chains made from the same fine silver that glistened on the table before me. I had sat there, helplessly watching as she set the table with meticulous and seemingly obsequious care, making multiple trips to and from the kitchen with an adorable little cart. The turkey she had brought out last, it taking all of her strength to hoist onto the table. You really went to so much trouble just to torment me. I asked hoarsely. My throat was parched, which made sense, as I hadn't had anything to drink in some time either. But for some reason, either the situation itself or something else she had done to me, the hunger was much more prominent in my mind.
Compared to everything else I've ever done for you, this was no trouble at all.
She replied glibly. A grandfather clock in another room softly chimed the hour, though I didn't bother to count the bells.
Oh, good. Dinner time. Food's getting cold, dear. Carve the turkey so we can eat.
How do you suggest I do that, dear? I sneered at her, clattering my restraints against the mahogany armrests of the chair I was in, wondering if maybe I could pull hard enough to break the wood.
It doesn't matter. Thanksgiving dinner is a ritual steeped in antiquated traditions. I upheld my end, spent hours making everything from scratch, and all you have to do is carve the damn turkey.
She hissed vehemently through her teeth.
But, per our usual, all my hard work goes unappreciated, while you can't even fulfill the most trivially token of your obligations. And also, per usual, I expect you have an excuse, rather than an apology. Yes?
You've literally chained me to a goddamn chair. I roared.
No, you see. That's the wrong answer.
She claimed.
You're going to have a lot of time to just sit there and think. And what I want you to think about is whether it's really my fault for putting you through this, or your fault for driving me to this in the first place.
I spat at her. It wasn't hard, considering my mouth held an overabundance of saliva as a result of the bounty of mouth-watering food, but my projectile fell short of its target.
And that's why I went with the refractory table, even though it's just the two of us.
She smirked, smugly placing her chin onto her folded hands. We were both silent for a long while after that. I decided that there was no point in wasting energy on screaming and threatening her. It would be futile, and any display of impotent rage would likely only amuse her. I wouldn't beg either. Not for food, not for freedom, not for anything. And it would be just as futile as threatening her, and far more humiliating. No, instead I focused on turning my arms back and forth in the hope of using the chains to saw through the wooden arms of the chair enough for me to break them. That's all it would take. Me breaking out of the chair to put an end to her little power fantasy and remind her who was boss. The chair was just ordinary wood. It really seemed like I should have had the strength to break it, especially if it was potentially a matter of life and death. But I was weak with hunger, and the hungrier I got, the weaker I got. My limbs lacked nearly all of their usual strength and felt like wet noodles hanging limply from my torso. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't muster any strength in them. Not that I was actually trying all that hard. The feast in front of me made it hard to focus on anything else. I thought that I could ignore it easily enough, that simple sensory saturation would soon render it an obscure background detail. But I was wrong. As my hunger grew, the feast seemed to grow with it. The food more sumptuous, the portions more decadent, every moist, succulent morsel glistening in the candlelight. It was still warm somehow, which made me wonder how long I had actually been there. I forced myself to look away from the glorious meal before me for just a few seconds, to see if I could spot anything that might give some indication of the passage of time. I glanced towards the window, but the curtains were drawn, and I couldn't really remember what time of day it had been to start with anyway. I looked around for a clock, but found none. Instead, what I saw was a painting hung behind the girl in the dress, depicting a mid-20th century American family sitting down to a holiday dinner, albeit one which was austerely meager compared to the one in front of me now.
Do you recognize it?
The girl in the dress asked. What? I asked groggily, unsure what she was even talking about.
The painting.
She clarified, pointing behind her.
It's Freedom from Want by Norman Rockwell. I chose it very specifically because I think freedom from want is exactly your problem. I don't believe you've ever had any non-trivial desire that has ever gone unfulfilled, which is why you're incapable of appreciating anything. You need to learn gratitude, which is what this holiday is all about, after all. You are going to want this food in front of you more than you've ever wanted anything. And when I'm convinced that you're truly capable of appreciating what I've made, of appreciating me, and everything I've done for you, then you can have some. Maybe.
I slumped my head then, in the hopes of falling asleep, and that sleep might see some of my proper strength return to me. I was tired There was no denying that. Exhausted even, and yet my weariness was nothing when compared to the hunger. The hunger would not allow me to sleep. It obstinately demanded that I satisfy it, and in doing so deprived me of the strength I needed to oblige it. It was a hell of a catch-22, to be sure. The hunger gnawed away at me from the inside, deciding that if I couldn't feed it, then it would feed upon me instead. I could feel the overproduction of acid start to dissolve my stomach walls, burning ulcers growing like cancer as the scorching bile shot up into my throat and dribbled out of my mouth. My innards growled and spasmed, sending waves of hunger pains radiating throughout my body. I was thrown into convulsions, and I dared to hope that these paroxysms might finally give me the strength I needed to break free of the chair, even if they had to break my bones in the process. My bones did break. I know because I saw their jagged, bloody ends sticking out of my mangled appendages. Despite this, I still could not wiggle loose from my chains, nor did I manage to break the arms of the chair. I was probably in the most pain I had ever been in my life, and yet somehow it was still insignificant compared to my exceptionally growing hunger. I was stewing in my own urine and excrement at this point, of course. But it had been some time since I had last evacuated my insides. My bodily stores must have been spent, I assumed. But this sparked a sudden realization in my sleep-deprived, dehydrated, hunger-ravaged brain. The girl in the dress had once left the table in all that time. She'd not yet taken any food or drink, still insisting that I be the one to cut the turkey. Nor had she slept or gone to use the restroom. And yet she still looked as picture perfect as she had when the whole ordeal started. It was the same with the food. It must have been days. It had to have been days, but the food was still warm and fresh and enticing as it ever had been. This isn't real. I groaned. This can't be real. The food wouldn't still be like this if it had been sitting out for this long. You can't have been sitting there this whole time without eating or sleeping or shitting yourself.
Watch your tongue, dear. It's Thanksgiving.
She gently scolded me. It's not fucking Thanksgiving. It's probably not even still fucking November anymore. I screamed. It was then that I heard the sound of Westminster chimes as the grandfather clock in the other room signaled that it was now 1:15 the hour, and to my horror, I had realized that this was the first time I had heard it since dinner had started.
What are you babbling about? It's only been 15 minutes, you big baby.
She taunted me.
But dinner is getting cold, and I'm getting hungry. So carve the turkey so that we can eat.
No, that's impossible. I murmured, the state of my body a testament to the fact that I had been bound there for days. And yet, the girl in the dress, the food on the table, and the chiming of the grandfather clock all stood testament to the fact I had not. How? I asked, more to myself than to the girl in the dress. I could think of no explanation for the gaping contradiction before me, nor did my hostess offer one. The horrifying implications of this paradox were obvious to me, even in my famished and exhausted state. If what felt like days to me were just minutes to her, then how long would she be able to keep me here? I got my answer soon enough. I was well past the point where I should have died of dehydration, and yet I continued to starve. I should have been hallucinating from the lack of sleep, and yet my hunger kept me lucid. The hunger, along with its effects on my mind and body, were distorting my experience of time. And the stronger my hunger grew, the more distorted time became. I sat there helplessly as my body wasted away to a mummified skeleton over what felt like weeks to me, only to break down into tears when I heard the Westminster chimes once again, letting me know that it was now half past the hour. The hungrier I got, the slower time moved, which meant I would probably be in a seemingly perpetual state of endless starvation without ever actually dying. Though my salvation was within arm's reach, I could not move my arms. I lacked the strength to even struggle against the chains now, and I feared that even if they were removed, I wouldn't have the strength to feed myself anyway.
Do you think that's enough then?
The girl in the dress asked.
If I unchain you, will you actually be grateful for once? For the food, for your freedom, for your life. For me. Just say it. If you can't say you're sorry and mean it, say how much you need me. Say how grateful you are to have had me in your life. And then beg me for help. I might do it.
Considering my severe state of bodily degradation, I knew that I would likely only be able to muster a couple of words. I think she realized that as well. With that in mind, I chose those 2 words very carefully. Fuck you. I coughed. Without warning, she slammed her hands down on the table and, for the first time since she had sat down, stood up from her chair.
You absolute fucking bastard! Why can't you let me have this?
She demanded, angry tears now rolling down her hot cheeks.
I literally offer you a feast when you're fucking starving, and you still can't appreciate me. I'm trying to help you, trying to make you a better person, and you still don't fucking care.
You're not the one chained to a chair. I forced myself to wheeze out. If I'm so much trouble, leave. Her face contorted wildly then, as if I had somehow just stabbed her through the heart. The angry tears gave way to ones of unadulterated sorrow, and without saying another word, she sat back down in her chair, then began sobbing into her hands. It was then that the chains holding me in place finally slackened and clattered to the floor, and whatever sort of spell I had been under was broken. I was, at long last, free to slake my hunger. But as I reached towards the table, my hopes of gorging myself upon a bountiful feast were cruelly snatched away. Now that my experience of time was in sync with realities again, it seemed that some toll needed to be exacted. The food which had remained miraculously preserved for so long now looked like it had been sitting out for weeks, swarming with flies and swimming with maggots. Everything was discolored and desiccated and smothered with hideous mold. A fetid reek of rot hung heavily in the air, slowly creeping out and infusing its stench into anything it came into contact with. And as I shoved the first handful of rancid, moldy, maggot-ridden turkey into my mouth, I felt thankful